Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're improving the lives of potential vault dwellers everywhere by making the experiments in Fallout 4's vaults ethical. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. So, we've covered the main story of Fallout 4 and the 3 major story DLCs, but there's still one thing left to talk about: Vault-Tec. In the world of Fallout 4, Vault-Tec is the ultimate evil corporation. They've got their greedy hands in all the wrong places and dedicated their pre-war existence to coming up with experiments for their supposed Fallout shelters that would make even the worst movie villain recoil. Normally, we just get to see the aftermath of the experiments, reading terminal entries and context clues to figure out what happened and what was supposed to happen. But today, we're going to be taking the role of Vault Overseer to design and redesign experiments. For the purposes of this video, we'll be dissecting the vaults in Fallout 4 and coming up with ways the experiments could be made ethical if we were to set something similar up in the real world. But before we get into the already failed experiments, we have the opportunity to forge new ground in Vault 88. Vault 88 was the main focus of the Vault-Tec Workshop DLC for Fallout 4 that was released on July 26, 2016. The vault itself is hidden in the southern portion of Boston and can be found after we intercept a distress signal on our Pip-Boy. Construction on the vault never made it past the early stages, and most of the crew inside the main chamber for it was killed in cave-ins or died over years from radiation sickness. But one person remained through it all. Valerie Barstow was tapped to become the overseer of Vault 88, and she was on site the day the bombs fell. In the centuries since, she wound up becoming a ghoul and was starting to lose hope that anyone from Vault-Tec would ever show up to help her finish her life's work. When a group of raiders started attacking the vault and trying to get in, she turned on the vault's distress signal and prayed that someone would hear it and come to her aid. Instead of getting someone from Vault-Tec, however, she got the sole survivor. Not being one to let a good opportunity go to waste, Overseer Barstow has a proposal for us. If we help her get the vault up and running and perform the experiments she wants to carry out with the devices she was given, she'll let us make the decision about the parameters of the experiments themselves. If we find anything objectionable in the way she wants to do things, we can simply change the experiment. This is fair enough, and after a few minutes of clearing rubble, turning on the vault's radio beacon, and setting up a basic structure, we're ready to get started on the first experiment. Before we can actually perform the experiments, though, we need to vet possible vault residents and figure out who will make the best candidate for these tests. The first candidate seems a little rough around the edges, but that's to be expected from someone who's likely spent their whole life in the wasteland. The second guy seems a little sketchy, and my lone wanderer sense started tingling when he asked if he would be allowed access to the entire vault with no restrictions. So I wound up kicking him to the curb. We can't have that kind of riffraff in our underground utopia. The third candidate seemed to be the charm, though. Clem might be a few fancy lad snack cakes short of a full box, but he is enthusiastic and just overall happy to be somewhere that isn't trying to kill him. After asking him a few questions, the Overseer agrees that he seems to be perfect for what we're looking for, and we start with the most important step in any human experiment: getting consent. For all of Overseer Barstow's faults, I have to give her credit for following at least this one ethical principle: Getting informed consent is always important when you're performing experiments on human beings. And while we could be a bit more explicit in letting Clem know what he's in for, the fact that we give him a chance to say no to participating is a great first step. Fitting him with an official Vault-88 jumpsuit, we head into the vault and build a terminal and the first device to be tested, the PowerCycle 1000. This is cutting-edge technology that will allow people to power the vault while they exercise. According to Barstow, the act of exercise is inherently selfish because it causes people to be in better health, allowing them to live longer and to become a strain on the vault's resources in their older age. This isn't completely wrong on the face of it, but her idea for the experiment isn't what I would call ethical. The parameters she would like us to choose include providing an electric shock to the person on the stationary bike when they drop below a certain output. While that could be helpful in theory, it also disincentivizes people from riding it because who wants to be shocked every time they take a break from exercising? The next possible parameter would likely make Barstow happy as well, as it involves dosing the rider with Buff-Out to give them an artificial boost to keep pedaling. Not only is this incredibly unethical because it involves giving people drugs against their will, but it also would mean needing to maintain a supply of Buff-Out in the vault to even make the system work. Even without those objections, the R&D notes mention people dying from the use of the drug, making it even worse as a way of getting people to cycle than the shock treatment. The final parameter to consider mainly focuses on providing a pleasant experience and natural positive feedback to riders, and that's the parameter I'm going with. There is no reason we can't turn exercise into a way to power the vault, and providing positive reinforcement for the activity is a great way to encourage people to hop on the bikes. I would even go a step further and offer people things like extra rations or some other special treat for reaching a specific goal each week. You have to think, these people are going to be trapped underground and won't exactly have the chance to go jogging on a local trail. So they're going to need some way to blow off steam and get some physical activity in. Why not make that activity help the vault? The next experiment requires a little field trip to a place called Hallucinogen Inc. on the north side of Boston. If there's enough interest in the comments, I might make a video covering Hallucinogen, but for now, we'll stay focused on the package that we need to recover from there for the next experiment. In the basement of the facility, we can find something labeled Vault-88 Chemical Research, a set of chemical formulas meant to provide drinkable liquid for the second problem Barstow sees in society: water breaks. You know how people at work like to hang out around the water cooler and talk about things? That's apparently a big no-no in Overseer Barstow's vision of the future. She sees the need to socialize with coworkers, or in this case fellow Vault inhabitants, as irrational, and she is hoping that this new experiment will solve that little problem. Building another terminal and the soda machine, we have another list of parameters to consider. The first parameter is apparently an appetite suppressant, meant to stretch the vault's food by making people consume less of it. One person died in the testing phase, and a couple couldn't even get out of bed to do anything productive in the vault, and this mixture is out of the question for those side effects alone. The second mixture makes people high and is even known to cause hallucinations, but at least it didn't kill anyone in the testing phase, I suppose. It apparently also smells and tastes awful, so we'll just set that one on the back burner for now. The final mixture winds up being the most ethical choice, as it is more or less just normal soda. They used caffeine, which is technically an addictive substance, but not really any worse than most of the other things someone might eat or drink in the wasteland. And they even tried to make it taste like Nuka-Cola. Barstow isn't happy with the results of the test, as she would have preferred that we went with one of the more dangerous mixtures, but there isn't really a benefit to be had with either of them. At least with the cycle, there was some, likely small, upside to the less ethical parameters. With this machine, there isn't really any positive in selecting the first two mixtures. The third experiment really brings out the evil intentions in Overseer Barstow, as she derides the Hippocratic Oath, the oath medical professionals take to do no harm, and asks us to build the Vault-Tec Phoropter, a piece of equipment that would fit nicely in an optometrist's office. She says it can technically be used to improve vision, but she has a more nefarious idea for it. The first possible parameter here involves showing the patient subliminal messages, leading them to have a more positive view of the vault and the overseer. This kind of secretive messaging has been used in a myriad of ways over the years, forcing people to like and subscribe to channels like Lost in Games on YouTube. But this particular implementation isn't really a great idea. If and when the people find out about the messaging, they are going to lose trust in the Vault's leadership and be less likely to want to participate in things that could actually be good for them and the Vault. You can go back and watch the breakdown I did of the Tuskegee experiment in the very first episode of this series for a better idea of the effect these kind of experiments have on people. The second set of parameters focuses on what amounts to a kind of mind-reading tech, where the device will display a picture of whatever the test subject is thinking of on a screen for everyone to see. It isn't perfect, and if people knew what it did, they might not be keen on using it. But it isn't quite as bad as the first parameter. The final and most ethical use that we can assign to this device is the perfectly normal ability to help improve the vision of those who use it. Given that we're going for the most ethical vault possible, this is the selection I'm making. The Overseer isn't thrilled that I've made all of her experiments ethical, but there is one more to set up, and she did her best to make this one the least ethical of all, while also using it as her audition for a AAA game studio in 2025. The device, in its most simple form, is a slot machine. The three options here aren't even really helpful to the Vault in any real sense, and I get the feeling that she was trying really hard to make this one count. The first parameter would provide a good chance of winning early on, while slowly decreasing the odds over time and taking advantage of the newly created problem gamblers. This is incredibly unethical, as it is taking advantage of psychology to hook people into something they might not have otherwise done, by giving them the euphoria of winning before changing the odds and making winning less likely. There's also no real point in doing this unless you're trying to run a casino built on nothing but profit. The second parameter is a standard slot machine, with random chance assigned to the device and a monitor to track which people in the vault are most likely to have an addiction to gambling. While this technically doesn't hurt anyone, at least not directly, it isn't really doing anything positive either. The final parameter is supposed to be some kind of control, but it really just shows that Overseer Barstow isn't very good at creating experiments. It more or less lets people win just about every time, which would be costly for the Vault and get boring for most people over time, as the allure of gambling in general lies more in the imagined idea of beating the odds and getting lucky than it does on actually winning anything. A slot machine in a vault as an experiment doesn't really work, even with Barstow's idea of using gambling as a positive motivational force. Positive reinforcement as a motivation is one thing, but getting people addicted to gambling, or monitoring who has an addictive personality, or just letting everyone win all the time feels like some low-grade work. I chose the third option for this experiment, having it be mostly just a cap distribution machine, mostly as a way to make Barstow mad, because I was just tired of her unethical predilections. As fun as it was to design these experiments, though, I think it's time to head out into the wasteland and redesign the experiments from the other vaults, starting with our home vault, Vault 111. According to the Overseer's terminal in Vault 111, the purpose of that vault was to test the long-term effects of suspended animation on unaware human subjects. Now, it's important to point out here that some scientific experiments require a certain level of ignorance on the part of the subjects to maintain the lowest possible level of bias in the results. But even in those experiments, the subjects are made aware of the fact that they are participating in a study and that there will be certain risks involved. If we were designing the Vault 111 experiment from the ground up, the first thing we would do would be to let the participants know that the vault is going to be home to an experiment that will come with certain risks. Many of the future residents would more than likely just be happy to be going underground rather than staying put as the bombs dropped, so it's even likely that most of them would agree to a higher level of risk than they would normally accept. I would also reassess whether or not the subjects actually need to be unaware of the fact that they will be frozen in cryopods. It's possible that Vault-Tec is testing for an emergency situation of some kind, where they would need to know if they were able to freeze people without their knowledge to keep them safe. But in order to have an experiment like this without informing the participants of what they would be going through, there would need to be some pretty good reasoning behind the plan. One other thing to point out here is the lack of planning Vault-Tec put into the food and supply storage that we actually talked about in the first episode of this series. Someone on that video actually commented that they thought Vault-Tec might be using this shortage as a sort of secondary experiment in the vault. This is intriguing and not really out of the realm of possibility, since we know Vault-Tec was notorious for that kind of thing. But if that was the case, they didn't really leave any evidence of the experiment for us to find. If they were monitoring how shortages like that would affect the staff of a cryo facility, they missed a couple of key things. Now, from here on out, we'll just assume that each and every experiment is missing the consent factor for ease, and we'll focus on other pieces of individual experiments. So one of the things that they would need if they are testing the reaction or ability to handle low supplies would be a control group, and perhaps even a couple of other groups with various levels of supplies to see how each was affected. For instance, they could have included a group that was given the same timeline for release from the vault, but intentionally only given half the supplies they needed to simulate some kind of emergency situation where a crew wasn't able to get enough food for an extended stay somewhere. It might have also been good to have a group with way more supplies than were needed to see how that would impact their willingness to stay longer than the expected release date. A control group in this instance would be one that was not only properly supplied, but one that was also released on time. This would be easier to accomplish if Vault-Tec actually lasted past the first few years after the bombs dropped. But based on what we see in the game, it isn't likely they're still up and running. And speaking of control groups, that's another thing they would need for the frozen residents. So let's assume the cryo chambers were the only major test, just for the sake of simplicity. What would that experiment look like from an ethical standpoint? Vault-Tec goes door to door to let people know about the vault and ask if they want to sign up. As part of the process, they inform future residents that there will be an ongoing experiment in the vault and that there could be side effects or unforeseen consequences to that test, while also pointing out that the alternative is to just hope that you make it through the blast and can somehow survive the fallout above ground. The pool of possible test subjects would need to be varied and include people of various health records and backgrounds to adequately produce reliable results, And those subjects would then need to be divided into several groups with care to make sure that they weren't filling one group with too many people from one particular background. For instance, you wouldn't want one group of people consisting mainly of those with compromised immune systems when those people aren't reflected in other groups, as that kind of thing could skew the results. The experiment itself should have at least 3 groups. 1 that is frozen and informed that they will be, and 2 that are frozen for varying lengths of time based on the needs of the study. For instance, there could be a group frozen for 3 months and another for 6 months. If planned properly, there could even be staggered releases every few months to see how extended freezing affects people over different amounts of time. The results of each group would need to be carefully tracked and cataloged, and any anomalies would need to be noted and tracked to see if they appear in multiple groups or are outliers. Honestly, there would need to be a lot of really detailed planning that would need to go into it, and I don't want this video to be 5 hours long, so I'll leave it there as I think we have a good start with this first vault. What do you think? If someone came to you and offered you a place in a vault where you could avoid the nuclear apocalypse while being frozen for an unspecified amount of time, would you do it? But Vault 111 is probably one of the easier vaults to correct. The next one we step into isn't quite as simple as just freezing people. Vault 81 is the only vault we can find in the wasteland that looks like it was successful. The people here are thriving, and it appears on the surface that whatever experiment Vault-Tec did was humane and allowed the residents to flourish. But there is a dark underbelly to this amazing place. One of the kids in the vault, a young boy named Austin, comes down with a serious illness as we're visiting, and the truth of the purpose of the vault is revealed as we explore what turns out to be a second vault hidden behind a movable wall panel in the basement. The scientists of Vault 81 were supposed to be working on a universal cure, a drug that would allow them to fight off any and all infections that might plague humanity. The initial stages of this experiment were actually pretty well done, with the focus being on testing various potential cures on mole rats to see how effective and safe they were. The whole thing goes off the rails, however, when it comes to the planned human side of the experiment. After passing the animal trials, the plan was to infect unaware human subjects with various ailments and then test the drugs out on them to see how safe and effective they were in humans. We're starting to see a pattern here when it comes to Vault-Tec, as they seem pretty dead set on not giving people the chance to consent to tests. Human trials in medicine sometimes include intentionally infecting people with various pathogens with their consent for the procedure. There is no reason Vault-Tec couldn't have included a brief mention that being in the vault would also include potential experiments, and then given the vault residents the chance to either accept or decline participation in the study. They could have even offered incentives like extra rations or some other reward for being involved while also making sure people were clued into the risk. In reality, the fact that Vault-Tec is so worried about trying to pull off these experiments without the subject's knowledge almost seems like nothing more than an attempt to make them a caricature of evil. So far, we're 2 for 2 on vaults that could actually be fixed pretty easily with just a little planning, and now I'm starting to wonder if they were just evil or incompetent in the scientific method and ethical procedures for experiments. Heading to the island of Far Harbor, we can find a little change-up in the kinds of experiments being done, and we can see the first vault that didn't really go as planned. Vault 118 was supposed to be a social experiment that tested the way social classes, namely the rich and the poor, would interact when put into a confined space. It was built under a hotel and was supposed to house wealthy individuals who were visiting Far Harbor on vacation at the time the bombs dropped, alongside whatever locals were able to make it in time before the vault sealed up. The locals, a lower-class working poor group, were to be taken to their part of the vault via a tour of the wealthy area, and the vault would then be sealed off and observed. The two groups were to be treated in very different ways, with the wealthy being basically above the law, waited on hand and foot by robot staff, and given every amenity they asked for, while the poor would be living in a cramped space with limited food and water, and having any rule breaking being judged by the wealthy to determine the punishment. Honestly, this kind of experiment has played out enough times in the real world in various ways that it doesn't even seem like one that would be worth having. What exactly would Vault-Tec seek to learn from pitting these groups against each other? This is more like filling a room with gasoline and lighting a match than an actual scientific study, and there isn't really much that can be done to salvage it. Actually, now that I think of it, I'm even pretty sure that I saw this exact experiment done in a Mr. Beast video at some point. So maybe Vault-Tec is just trying to go viral. This is the first more social kind of experiment that we've run across, but it isn't the best or even the last one that we'll see. Vault 118 is really more intriguing for its murder mystery, so let me know in the comments if you want to see a video discussing the drama and ethics of how the residents of the vault wound up as brains and robots. If there's enough interest, I'll dive into it at some point in the next few months. If we're looking for a social experiment that could actually wield some interesting results, we need to go no further than Vault 114. Keen observers will recognize Vault 114 as the hideout for Skinny Malone, and the place where we first meet Nick Valentine. The plan for this luxury vault was to cram a bunch of high-ranking government officials, locally important people, members of the business community in Boston, and their families into tight quarters to see what would happen. They were lied to about the living arrangements, being told they would be living in one of the nicest vaults in the Commonwealth, which is a breach of ethics in a way, but that wasn't even the worst of it. The vault overseer position, a spot usually filled by someone with at least a little scientific or leadership ability, was to be filled by the worst possible candidate they could find. They wanted someone with as little experience as possible and who had a strong anti-authority bias. They even encouraged the idea that discomfort and harm could come to the residents, and it almost sounds more like someone at Vault-Tec had a vendetta rather than an actual scientific reason for this study. That being said, there is a way that they could make this whole thing work, ethically speaking. Obviously, having the consent of the residents to participate in a study is a must, and while it might be a little more complicated to acquire, it wouldn't be too hard if the representative played to their egos. It would also be wise to make sure not to mention or allude to luxury or living conditions at all as part of the process, as that poisons the well a bit. If they know the quarters will be cramped, they might be prepared ahead of time to deal with that, or even choose not to participate. This would hurt the results, so it's best to tell them that it's a vault and let their imagination fill in the details. It's important not to set expectations, because then the study winds up being more about expectation versus reality, as opposed to seeing how the rich and powerful would handle being in a cramped space. And I just have to say, on the surface of it, this experiment actually seems rather interesting. You're taking people who are used to getting their way and having plenty of space and resources and sticking them in tight quarters where they are no longer catered to or are able to get their way all the time. I would hypothesize that the more egotistical among them would have a harder time dealing with the setup, And the experiment itself could even help shape how future bunkers or vessels for the ocean or space were designed. I would also fix the problem they've got with the overseer here. See, the concept of putting someone completely off their rocker in charge of these people might seem great on the surface, but there are safety factors that need to be considered. The better option would be to put someone in charge who was competent but also willing to play a part. They could act anti-authority and allow things to get a little uncomfortable without going overboard. And they could even show up as competent just enough to make the vault residents wonder what was going on. Other than that, I don't really have much more to add to Vault 114, as it isn't overly ambitious or wild as far as plans for vaults go. The concept was there, and there were really only a couple of small tweaks needed to make it more in line with our ethical principles. Hopefully, the next vault is this easy. Making our way to the Malden Middle School on the northern side of Boston, we discover a vault that didn't just ignore ethics, it took a dump on them and lit them on fire. Vault 75 is a straight-up eugenics experiment. The plan here was to create a better-managed Lord of the Flies situation, where children were raised to the ripe old age of 18 and then either made into security, scientists, or ashes. They would monitor the kids in the vault, indoctrinating them, giving them hormones, selectively breeding them, and rushing the whole thing along to see how fast they could create what they deemed as the perfect human. Ethically speaking, there isn't really much to say here, as not getting informed consent is the smallest problem they have. Killing off those who didn't make the cut in their eyes is never okay. And so long as they believe it's possible to breed out genetic defects, there isn't much that can be done to make anything about this experiment ethical. I'd redesign the whole thing from the ground up, focusing on ways to maximize the abilities of members of a population through education and training, focusing specifically on creating adults that can improve society as a whole. For instance, in both the game world and the real world, the result of the education children received decades prior to the bombs being dropped was having a generation of people who would drop nuclear bombs on each other and destroy the world. Could some kind of societal checks and specific training prevent children from growing into hateful, warmongering adults? That would be a long-term experiment worth conducting, and one that could actually be ethically done without too many issues. The hypothesis of this experiment could focus on how biases and the inclination to fight those who we consider part of the outgroup are things that we can move past with the proper structure and education. It could focus on conflict resolution techniques and really emphasize history as a way to learn about the pitfalls of society and the human condition. This experiment would not only keep the parents of the kids alive at the beginning, but would also allow people to grow old and allow for monitoring the results to see how effective certain techniques are over the lifetime of individuals, so that if and when a new society is set up, it could be set up in a way that would maybe prevent future great wars. Leaving behind our dreams of utopia, we wind up on the edge of the glowing sea in Vault 95. This vault actually did a lot right, but then fell apart in a single day. See, Vault 95 was full of people who'd been struggling with addictions to various chemicals, and it was more or less advertised as a post-nuclear war rehab facility. For the first 5 years, everything went pretty good. The residents held support meetings and helped each other through withdrawal. And I wouldn't even be talking about this vault if it weren't for the stash of drugs that Vault-Tec planted for the residents to discover at the 5-year mark. This is one of those instances where Vault-Tec feels the incessant need to turn everything into some unethical, immoral experiment, and the only real change that I would make would be to get rid of the experiment and not let these people live in peace. They've managed to overcome addiction, and they should be proud of that. They shouldn't have their resolve tested by some company that thinks playing with people's lives is a fun pastime. Part of me kind of wants to see an experiment involving unsuspecting Vault-Tec employees now. You didn't think we'd talk about the vaults and not mention Vault-Tec Among the Stars from the Nuka World DLC, did you? This attraction, nestled in the Galactic Zone, is really more of a showroom than a vault. But that doesn't mean it's safe to visit. Even as they're working to sell entrance into vaults around the country, they're running tests on unsuspecting park patrons. Well, park patrons and a few of the employees. I'll be honest here, there isn't really much to object to other than the lack of informed consent that we've hit on so many times in this video. The experiments themselves could potentially have some bearing on making improvements to equipment or some kind of tool to better or maybe worsen life in general. And if they just had taken the time to recruit the subjects in the right way, they could have actually made this a pretty mundane and normal experiment. And that's the thing about Vault-Tec. They were never a scientific organization or even one interested in bettering humanity. If the experiments they ran, or were planning to run, tell us anything, it's that the people in charge were sadistic and were more interested in torturing people than actually doing any good. If I didn't know any better, I'd say a lot of these vaults were designed by John Kramer. Despite that, there were still people that worked for Vault-Tec that weren't on board with the whole thing, as we can see from a terminal entry from one Martin Reed back at Vault-Tec HQ in downtown Boston. Mr. Reed was concerned with some of these shipments being sent to the vaults, and was appalled by the idea that the vaults were being used to run experiments as opposed to housing the residents in a safe environment to wait out the end of the world. His concerns fell on deaf ears, but the fact that anyone in the Vault-Tec world had a conscience is at least a little encouraging. As far as the experiments in the vaults, that's really the end of the line. There are other vaults in the Fallout universe, and as much as I'd like to explore them, that will have to wait. We've pretty much covered all of the big stuff that I wanted to talk about in Fallout 4, and while there are a ton of side quests and random encounters waiting out there for us, the Philosophy and Ethics in Games series will be moving on to a new game starting next week. That adventure will take us from one coast of the United States to another, and from one iconic city in ruins to one that's seen better days. To make sure you don't miss that or any of the other videos in the Philosophy and Ethics in Games series, hit the like button below and make sure that you're subscribed to Lost in Games on YouTube. If you want to help support the channel in other ways while getting cool perks like having your name on the screen in videos, check out my channel memberships here on YouTube, or become a patron over on Patreon. For just a couple of bucks a month, you can help me get new games to cover and upgrade my storage to store more gameplay footage from those games. That's all I've got for this one. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.